First day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight.
Add to your faith virtue, to your virtue knowledge, to your knowledge self-control, to your self-control patience, to your patience godliness, to your godliness brotherly kindness, to your brotherly kindness add love.
The definition of faith, Hebrews chapter 11 defines faith for us, and it gives us examples of faith. And every single example that we have of faith is coupled with obedience.
I've heard before a connection in terms of mercy and grace. I think those two things are tied together. Mercy is God withholding what we do deserve. But when God is gracious, he's giving us what we do not deserve. And
Christians need to be mindful of that. You may have to sacrifice in order to have to obey God.
We need context, right? When we talk about authority in the scriptures and understanding the scriptures, we always have to talk about context.
It was a profound saying from Genesis 2. But what he was saying is it was really a shadow of the relationship of Christians and Christ, the church and Christ himself. Notice in verse 13 of Acts chapter 8, right? Even Simon believed and was baptized.
Simon Sorcerer is a really good example of this, because it's very clear when you read Acts chapter 8 that Simon was saved. Nowhere does he say, I'm going to build my churches. Sometimes it's really hard, but you just can't quit. You got to keep going. And that's what Christianity is all about, is to keep going.
And the New Testament is that by which we will be judged. Now these were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word of God with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to find out if these things were so. Join us as we look into the inspired text of King Jesus with the same desire and approach to discover the will of God with Berean spirits. Hello and welcome back to Berean Spirits. My name is Chris Peltz. I'm the evangelist working with the Southside Church of Christ in Springfield, Missouri. And we've got everybody back with us today. Mr. Josh Thornhill with the Brookmead Church of Christ over in Johnson City, Tennessee. Josh, man, how you doing?
I'm doing all right, I reckon.
Yeah, you doing better, all recovered and just...
Yeah, if I could just quit the coughing, I'd be okay.
Yeah, that's all right. We'll manage a little bit with it. We'll suffer through with you for a little while today. Yep. And we got Craig.
Considering our topic.
Yeah, right. Well, are you really my neighbor? All right. We've got Craig Benny from the Lake of the Ozarks Church of Christ in Central Missouri. Craig, how you doing?
I think I'm back to peachy. I'm doing pretty good.
Okay. All right, man. Oh man, and peaches are in season. Wahoo!
We have a fresh market produce store just north of town. They just got in some good peaches.
Yeah,
delicious.
There you go. There you go. Well, we'll have to see how Mr. Richard Dodson is doing with the Kearney Church of Christ up in Kearney, Missouri. Rich?
Well, I reckon I'm doing okay.
Well, I guess that's debatable.
I'm not over in Kentucky, but I think I could speak like this anyway, can't I?
Well, I don't know. Why would you want to talk like that? What are you saying about
Tennessee?
Oh.
I noticed.
Josh, he sounded a lot like Colton, and Colton's from Missouri.
Well, maybe he should be from East Tennessee. I don't know. I was captivated when I heard it. I reckon so. I reckon. That's the guy who makes the words. I reckon so.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I guess
loving your neighbor.
I know it. Yeah, I know it. So,
Tennessee doesn't border Missouri, does it?
Yes, it does.
Does it really?
Yes, it does.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, Josh.
Just pay attention to what we're about to talk about. So.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah,
they reckon all you want.
I can't wait till he starts to say yens.
Ewans?
Yeah, yuns or yens. Yeah, that's something.
just
When
stick
you're
with
preaching,
y'all.
do you talk like that? I mean, is that the only language that you guys over there understand? Is like reckon and yens and stuff? Is that the way you preach?
Not really.
I mean, I don't understand what Richard's talking about because I hear that and I use that here in Missouri more than anything else. Oh,
He's just being
use
contrary.
the word reckon in the pulpit.
yeah, I reckon so.
I'm
yeah.
sure I have at times.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure I could preach in Alabama. I don't think I could talk that slow.
Oh boy.
I love calling the bookstore down there, man. I just to hear them talk. I just called up and I'm like, hey, I just called for a conversation. I don't want any books. I just want to hear you guys talk a while.
So at this point, do we just close it down and try again, or
I know it. That's it.
Yeah.
like tune in next week, everybody, when we actually talk about the Bible?
Yeah, and loving your neighbor and not making fun of how they talk and all that. Yeah,
Richard.
I, for one, love my brethren from the southern states
absolutely.
and how they talk.
Yeah, man, that's right.
Shame on you guys.
The South will rise again. Oh
Anyway.
boy. Right. All right. So we're going to be talking about loving your neighbor today. Yes, we are actually going to do that. Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 40 is what we're going to get into in our study today. Very quickly, before we get into that, I do want to encourage folks, if you're listening on whether it's YouTube or on Facebook, be sure and hit that subscribe and that like button and share out our program. We do appreciate that. And leave a comment and join the conversation, the biblical conversation, that is. And if you have any questions about things that we're talking about or other Bible questions, go ahead and leave those in the comments. We'll do our best to get to them. If not today, then next week. We'll get to those. But yeah, we love to hear where everybody is from and that you're listening. We really do appreciate those comments that folks put in. So as we get into the study today, in Matthew chapter 22, first of all, hear Jesus addressing kind of a question that had come up. And he makes the point to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And for this is the first and great commandment. With promise to love, and the second like it is this: to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's basically what we're going to be talking about. But I want to point out that what Jesus is saying in Matthew 22 is not a new command. This isn't a new thought or a something that is new to the new covenant. In fact, going back to the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5, and I'm just going to do a quick survey here, and I'm not even hitting all the passages in Deuteronomy, but I want you to notice just how often this is pointed out. Deuteronomy chapter 6 in verse 4 and 5. Love the Lord your God. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Deuteronomy chapter 10 in verse 12 and 13. To love the Lord your God. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 15. A couple of times it's mentioned to love the Lord your God. Chapter 13, verse 3. Love the Lord your God. Over and over and over again in the book of Deuteronomy. So this is not a new thought that Jesus is coming up with here in Matthew chapter 22 in addressing this question of this young individual. And even the idea of loving your neighbor is not a new thought to the new covenant, because when he points out that all the law and prophets hang on these two commandments, when you look at the 10 commandments, for example, in the 10 commandments, the first 4 are centered around loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The last 6 of the 10 commandments are centered around loving your neighbor as yourself. And so that's imperative for us, I think, first of all, to understand that this is something God has expected of us, of his people, of his children, of his creation. He's always expected this of us, to respect one another, to love one another. But in the new covenant, it's especially emphasized for us today when it comes to loving our neighbor as ourselves. And so that's what we're going to be getting into in our study this morning. So, Josh, I want to start with you here in not just in our text of Matthew 22, but when we talk about loving our neighbor and how that not only is to be seen, but how we put that into practice, how we first of all approach this idea, and maybe make sure that we talk about when it says as yourself.
Okay. Jesus, as we've discussed there in Matthew 22, Jesus has been asked a question, what is the greatest commandment? And he tells the two greatest commandments. The first is love the Lord your God, and the second is love your neighbor as yourself. In order to love our neighbor as ourselves, we first have to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. I think it starts there. That's the most important thing. When we love God like we should, when we honor God the way that we should, when we hold God in with the esteem that we should, then we're going to look at the world differently. Our perspective of the world around us is going to change, and it's going to be impacted by the fact that we love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. In the book of Exodus, chapter 20, when God gives the 10 commandments, I've heard it said before, and I think it fits well. The first 4 commandments deal with our relationship with God. You shall have no graven images, no other gods before me, don't take the Lord's name in vain, and remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. That is loving the Lord your God with all your heart. It's going to affect, it's dealing with your relationship with God. The last 6 deal with our relationship with our neighbors. Don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't, on and on and on. All those things that are related to our relationship to our neighbors. By default, when we honor the Lord, when we do what God says, we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, because we're not going to do anything that's contrary to our neighbor. We're not going to harm our neighbor. We're not going to do things that are going to be unloving or unkind to our neighbors, because we love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And of course, when we hold God in high esteem, we're also going to recognize the fact that we are made in the image of God, and that our neighbors are made in the image of God. I think sometimes we lose that because we're driving down the road and some guy cuts us off, or some guy's a jerk to us while we're driving down the road, and we want to honk at them and we want to be a jerk to them. But we need to remember that just like us, they're made in the image of God. And I think when we develop that perspective that all people around us are made in the image of God, and that one day we're all going to stand before the Lord in judgment, that gives us a slightly different perspective to look upon others with. And I think when we consider all those things, it helps us to appreciate why Jesus tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, or to love our enemy, even in Matthew chapter 5. And I think part of the challenge that we have as far as loving our neighbor as ourselves is we don't understand what love is in terms of biblically speaking. Because we hear the word love, we think of the love that a boyfriend or girlfriend might have, or a husband or wife might have. That's not what Jesus is calling upon us to have here. The love that he's calling upon us to have is to seek the very best for those around us. I care enough about them that I want to do what's best for them. Sometimes that means that I'm going to share the gospel with them. Sometimes that means if I see them walking disorderly, I'm going to correct them. And so loving my neighbor as myself means that I'm going to care enough about them that I want to do what's in their best interest. And that doesn't mean I'm always going to be all ushy-gushy and lovey-dovey towards them. But I'm going to tell them what they need to hear, and I'm going to act in their best interest. And usually that means that I'm going to do what I can to help lead them toward the gospel and lead them toward God, so that they can enjoy the blessings that are found in Christ Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point to make sure we emphasize, and that is that love is a choice, not an emotion. That the love under consideration, is a choice that we make.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
You were mentioning
Big splash.
Yeah, cannonball. There comes the cannonball. All right, you were mentioning the and there's no more water in the pool. Uh, you were mentioning how love has always been commanded, and it has. And Josh did a pretty good job showing how we're supposed to, you know, love in the New Testament. He did a pretty good job. Uh, but there is a point I think John 15:12 makes, and when Jesus said, "You have to love one another as I have loved you," and I think that's really important because in the Old Testament we didn't have that example.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's John 3:16. God so loved the world he gave his only begotten Son. Well, now we're in the New Testament we're seeing how deep love really is. I mean, true love is being manifested with Jesus Christ. So when we're talking about loving our neighbor as ourselves, now we're also talking about loving our neighbor as Jesus loved us. That goes in with what Josh was saying, and that's very much a sacrificial love.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely it is. And as we get into this, I think there are several ways we can see that this is manifest, that this shines through. But it's interesting because in Luke 10, we have an account where not only is this being questioned as far as loving your neighbor, but then there's another question, and that is, who is my neighbor? And so, maybe if we answer that question very quickly, and Craig, if you want to take that, answer that question, who is my neighbor? Then perhaps we could move forward then in talking about some of the applications when it comes to, how it's going to be seen in loving our neighbor.
Yeah, of course, Luke chapter 10 starts out a little differently. It's interesting. A lawyer comes to Christ. In Matthew, he's stated as a lawyer as well, but it's a Pharisee who happened to be a lawyer. But the lawyer comes to Christ and he says, how should I how do I inherit eternal life? Or he says, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus answers and says, what's written in the law, and what is your reading of it? Which is interesting because he points him, what we were talking about, we points him back to the Old Testament. And the Pharisee quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and then he quotes from Leviticus chapter 19 when he says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's Leviticus 19 and verse 18. And then he gets his answer. And of course, the answer is love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. And the second is like it. In Matthew says the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, you've answered rightly. Go and do that and you'll live. And so seeking to justify himself, the scriptures say, he asked another question. Which is, who is my neighbor? And then to answer that question, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which we're all pretty familiar with, I believe, probably anyways. But you have this Jew who has been beaten by thieves and left, robbed and beaten and left for dead. And you have a priest comes by and he passed on the other side and he ignores him. He has that looks an awful lot like a you problem mentality, that we hear a lot these days. And so, he's, that's not my circus over there. I'm going to pass on the other side of the road. I'm not even going to get involved. And then we have the Levite comes, we have the priest, and then the Levite comes and he passes on the other side. His brother comes, passes on the other side. And then when the Samaritan comes, he takes the man, cleans and bandages the man, puts him on his own animal, takes him to the inn, pays for his room, and then takes on his debt to the inn. He said, anything more that you that it's going to cost, I'll pay for it when I come back. So it's not just he got him there and he paid for his first night's stay. He paid for everything. And so kind of looking back on what we're talking about, the Good Samaritan. I wonder how many people understand what that means. I think a lot of people understand that there's some animosity between the Samaritans and between the Jews in the New Testament. But Samaria was the capital of Israel during the divided kingdom. Samaria was where the king lived. That's where the royalty lived. That's the capital. And so Israel is taken into captivity, and some are left behind in the capital. And then the Babylonians replace some others into the area. And so they intermingle and they intermarry with the Jews, and you get the Samaritans. And so you have this in the Jewish mind, this half-breed who came in and populated their capital, their land. And so these are invaders, intruders. And so you get this animosity between the two groups. Of course, you come in and you're displaced by a kingdom from your own land and put in this other land, and the people there hate you, and the people that you came from hate you. And you can see where the animosity from both sides kind of grows there. And so, but back to the Good Samaritan, you have this person who is for generations has been had this hate cultivated between the two people, the Jews and the Samaritans. And to answer the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus says there's a Samaritan who treated a Jewish guy with love. And then he asked the question again, who do you think was the better neighbor to the man? And of course, the answer is the Samaritan was, right? And so the example, who's your neighbor? Well, that certainly includes your enemies. It includes everybody. And so when we're to say love your neighbor as yourself, neighbor doesn't mean the state bordering you, Richard. It means everybody. He knows that. He was just being facetious earlier, but it means everybody. It means everybody, whether friend or foe. It means everyone who is made in the image of God, which is everyone. So black, white, slave, free, male, female, it doesn't matter. Love your neighbor.
Yeah. And in fact, I like to look at that particular parable in the sense that Jesus is telling him, you're asking the wrong question when you ask, who is my neighbor? The question really is, whose neighbor am I? Right? We're to be neighborly. And that's, I think, the point of that parable is that the Samaritan was being a neighbor. It's not that the Samaritan looked at this Jew who'd been beat up and left for dead as a neighbor, but the Samaritan was being neighborly, was being a neighbor to this person. And that's the approach that we need to take. We need to be the ones who are the neighbor to those around us and take into consideration their needs, which I think is what Josh pointed out earlier, is looking at the needs of those around us and putting those first. And so many examples that we have, Philippians chapter 2, where you have in the first few verses talking about thinking of the things of others. And Richard pointed out that we have the example of Christ. And that's exactly what Paul, by inspiration of King Jesus in Philippians 2, points out, that we have this example now of Christ, who left the habitations of the glories of heaven and came to this earth in the flesh and served God, and we in like manner ought to serve others. We ought to be putting others first ahead of ourselves. And when we see the applications of all this, the Sermon on the Mount is great. And I know you guys have mentioned Matthew chapter 5, but it goes through and really shows, many applications, whether it's your enemy, whether it's your wife. Yes, even your spouse is considered your neighbor when it comes to context of Scripture. And so all of these things, those around you, is important for us to understand when it comes to how we treat others, whether it's brethren, whether it's our enemy, whether it's those around us. It really doesn't matter who we're talking about. We need to take the approach of loving them. what is it? 1 John 4, verse 10, 11, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and gave his son. So we ought to love one another. Our love for our neighbor and those around us is not dependent upon how they've treated us. It's dependent upon us realizing what God has done for us. And that's where this love for our neighbor is going to be motivated and manifest out of that relationship that we have with God.
I think about, going back to what Craig said, another good example is how Jesus told his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. I mean, they took what man needed, and Jesus provided something they couldn't have. He provided for them, and then he sent men out to give them that gospel. And he went to all the world. And so to me, that answers the question, who's my neighbor? Because that's exactly what's taking place. You're going to everyone, as Craig pointed out, without discrimination. You didn't care what nationality they were. You didn't care about what race they were. You preached to them. And as Romans 10 said, that shows the necessity of preaching. How can anyone believe if they don't hear the preaching of the gospel? And so that's what Jesus sent these men out to do. That's what they did. And so in Christ, they were manifesting their love for their neighbor by providing for them what the Lord had provided for the disciples. And that is something that none of us could have provided for ourselves, that gospel that saves. And so they were willing to do that. Now think about what's being undertaken here. To take the gospel to the whole world, that's not some simple, that's not easy. They didn't have the internet back then. They had to go to do that. That's what Jesus said. You got to go. And there was going to be hardships, as we read about in Acts and many of Paul's letters. There was going to be all kinds of hardships resulting from persecution, but they endured. They kept preaching. I mean, there was times that there was plagues that they had to work through. They did that. They endured. I say plagues, illnesses. There was all kinds of things that they had to endure. Why did Paul do that? Why do we have the example of Paul suffering all those things, as well as the rest of those apostles? Why did they do that? Well, that's because Jesus taught them that they are to love their neighbor as Jesus loved them. And so that's what they did. That's why they did what they did. And that's why we're supposed to do the same thing. We need to take what the Lord has given to us and to go out and give to those who need it as well. And of course, that's every man. And that's why we need to be proclaiming the gospel.
Yeah. I mean, Jesus said sometimes it is as simple as providing a cup of water. But Josh, I want you to address, as we kind of get into maybe some very more real world applications, because I think we've established very clearly, from scriptures, the idea, the notion, what God expects, but sometimes making this application, and I think about our speech more than anything else, in how we talk to people. But like on the first day of the week, services are over, and let's say we go out to eat lunch, and there'll be other people who are there who are obviously coming from services of whether it's a denomination or some other church somewhere, and they treat the servers and the workers there like garbage. I mean, they're just rude. They're mean to them. And then we're right behind them. Right. And as far as they know, we're cut from the same cloth, even though we're not, but they don't know any better. And so it's even more important, I think, sometimes for us to make sure that what we're saying and how we're saying it is something that gives grace to the hearer. What's that?
I said, you reckon?
I reckon so. Yeah.
Certainly, speech is important. Sometimes it's not what we say, but how we say it. That is the problem. I think it's our speech is important, and I think we need not underestimate just how important our speech is in terms of our relationship with others, because what we say is an indication of what's in our hearts. And if we're rude to other people, if we're hateful towards those around us in what we say, that's a reflection of our heart. That's a reflection of who we are. And that's who, and you know, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, you don't know the mind of God except that which he reveals to you. And the same thing is true with men. People don't know our hearts except what we say and what they see us doing. And so if what we say is unkind or hateful or things such as that, then, you know, people aren't going to think too highly of us as people, and in the sense they really shouldn't. But there's a verse that I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the past couple of years. And that's Ephesians 4 and verse 31 and 32. In verse 31, Paul says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice." And so get rid of all these hateful attitudes that lead us to be ugly and unkind and rude and hateful to those around us. And then verse 32, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ has also forgiven you." One thing that we need to do, whether it's in our actions or in our speech, we need to remember that one of the characteristics of love is kindness. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4, love is kind. That's the second thing that's mentioned there in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is long-suffering, love is kind. And so in every interaction, regardless of how people are treating us, we need to make sure that we're being kind towards them. They could be as hateful towards us. They can be cussing us out, do whatever. We need to make sure that we respond in kindness. Because that's how love acts. Love does not behave rudely. And so we need to think carefully before we interact with others. And you know, when people are rude to us, whether we're driving down the road, or whether somebody's been short with us, or whether somebody, you know, did something that offended us or that hurt us, we need to remember love does not behave rudely. Love is kind. And so in what we say and what we do, we need to make sure that we're demonstrating the characteristics of love. And I've said this in sermons before. Read through 1 Corinthians 13 verses 4 through 7 and take out the word love and insert your name there. And if it's not true, you need to change. You need to change. You need to make sure that you're demonstrating the characteristics of love in all that you do. There's never a reason when it's okay to not act in a loving way. And I think that's one of the problems that we have in our society today. People get on their keyboards, and just because they're not there personally with somebody, they act all hateful and ugly towards others. We need to have the characteristics of love in all that we do, and that includes on social media, by the way.
You know, and that's actually a point that's not anything new for us today, because remember the accusation that the church at Corinth made against Paul. You know, oh, you're only bold in this letter because you're not here with us, right? And he's like, no. As he wrote back, he's like, that's not the case at all. You know, he was being kind and correcting them and telling them what they need. And that's something else, you know, with love. That doesn't mean we overlook sin. It doesn't mean that we, you know, we're all lovey-dovey and like everything is okay regardless of what they do. You know, being kind is providing what is needed. And sometimes correction is needed, and that can be a loving thing. But how we do it, you made a statement that I hear from my wife all the time. It's not necessarily what you say, but how you say it. And it is so true, because it comes across, and which is why it's so important if you can have conversations with people face to face, because, you know, sometimes writing things, you know, the attitude does or does not come across, you know, possibly in the wrong way. But, you know, and Richard, if there's any comments or anything that folks have that you want to jump in, you can go ahead and jump, you know, with that anytime. Otherwise, I'm going to go on to Craig for just a minute. So
Oh, you go to Craig.
Yeah. So Craig, we've talked about, our verbal, our speech and how that is done. But, there are some times when, speech, they're not listening, right? We have that in 1 Peter chapter 3 with the wife and her husband, and so it gets to our actions, and our actions have to line up with our speech, but our actions sometimes, are things that are just simply, what we have done for others, even if we haven't said anything.
Yeah. So first, you mentioned First Peter, rather, chapter 3. That's actually something I was wanting to bring up. Well, move back in the context a little bit. It's something I wanted to bring up. First, chapter 3 is kind of middle of the point that's being made by Peter here. It starts all the way back in chapter 2, and well, it starts all the way back in the end of chapter 1, but his conclusion starts in chapter 2 and verse 11. Where he says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation." And so his kind of going chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, or verse 1 through 6, kind of fall into the same context where he's telling people to act honorably amongst those who are outside the church, the Gentiles. That's what he means by Gentiles here. Those who are non-Christians. He says act honorably, and there's a reason for that. It's so that when they view your works, they view who you are. In chapter 3, he says that your husbands see your chaste conduct. They may be won without a word. And so here it says that they may glorify God in the day of visitation. Our actions, what people see about us, says a lot. You might not think people are watching you, but people are, in fact, watching you. This actually happens to be one of my favorite pastimes. People watching. You go around and just see how people are behaving and how they treat one another and that kind of thing. Walmart's a great place for that. It's funny most of the time and sad often, but people are watching you. People see who you are. When you go into a restaurant, we've used this example already. When you go into a restaurant and the people know who you are. You're in the town you live in. You've introduced yourself. You leave maybe you're a preacher. You leave a business card for an invitation for services or a Bible study. I do that. That's a practice I have been keeping for several years. They know who you are, and so they're going to apply your conduct with what you identify as.
Yeah.
There's a somewhat sad quote that I like from Gandhi. I don't agree with Gandhi on almost anything, political or religious. I almost don't agree with him on anything. But he said one time that he said, "I like your Jesus, but your Christian is nothing like your Jesus." And that is a sad statement. It's a sad statement that for Christianity in general, it's definitely a sad statement for the church, for true Christians, that people in the world see us, and what they see is not Christ. And we need to change that. In Romans chapter 2, talking to the Jews, Paul rebuked them, saying, "You who boast in the law, do you not also keep the law? So you say, do not murder. Do you also murder? You say, do not commit adultery. Do you also commit adultery?" And then he says his conclusion of that is, "The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." Christians need to realize when we don't act accordingly, not just our speech. A lot of times Christians say the right things, but their behavior shows something completely different. And you'd mentioned earlier that you see you see denominations and other churches in the restaurants, and oftentimes they're behaving very poorly. Well, I've been in restaurants with Christians that are with members of the church that I've gone out to eat with on Sunday afternoons, and those Christians are behaving pretty rudely,
Sure,
pretty poorly. I'm not going to say names or anything, but I have an example of somebody, seen an example of a Christian in a Mexican restaurant outright being racist. It's not just not just a playful thing, not just a misstep. It was pretty brutal. You have to rebuke that when it comes up, but people heard that. People saw what she was doing. People heard what she said, and it stuck with them, and I know it stuck with them. We need to behave in a way. Josh brought up 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You break down 1 Corinthians 13. The main points are love does not seek its own. Love does not tear down others. Love does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. And love endures. Love lasts. And if we're going to say we love our neighbor, can we honestly say that we don't tear them down? Can we honestly say that we correct and rejoice in the truth and not rejoice in their sins? Can we honestly say that we don't treat them in a way that is trying to elevate ourselves above them? Our actions need to be showing that.
Yeah. I mean, they have to line up with our speech and in all of that, in whatsoever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord, not only by his authority, but showing that it is Christ living in us. Richard, any last thoughts?
No, I'm good.
You good?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, I could say some more, but we're out of time.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, folks, we do appreciate everybody who tunes in and listens, and be sure and leave a comment. Let us know where you're listening from. If you have any thoughts or questions you want to add to the study for folks to look at later, go ahead and do that as well in the comments. And of course, we will be back here next Thursday, Lord willing, at 10 a.m. As always, Richard Dodson is on Gospel Preaching Live Thursday nights and Sunday evenings. If you go to BereanSpirits.com, you can find out more information about the works that everyone is involved in. And so that'd be a good spot for you to go to, BereanSpirits.com. Until next time, remember to search the scriptures daily with Berean Spirits.
Thank you for watching Berean Spirit.